Welcome to the deep dive. So if you've ever been looking for, a shortcut to better focus, maybe deeper relaxation, or just feeling a bit less anxious, you've probably stumbled across binaural beats. The market is just flooded with these audio tracks. They all promise to literally tune your mind using sound.
The promise sounds incredible, right? But our mission today, it's pretty simple. Does the science actually back this up? Can these sounds really influence, maybe even control, your brainwaves? So we're diving deep into a major 2023 systematic review of the empirical research. We want to cut through all the hype and get to the actual science of brainwave entrainment. Okay, let's start right at the beginning, the mechanics. What is a binaural beat? Well, fundamentally, it's an auditory illusion. You put on headphones, right? Your left ear gets one frequency, let's say 400 hertz, and your right ear gets a slightly different one, maybe 420 hertz. Now, because those tones are close, your brain doesn't really hear two separate tones. Instead, it perceives this single kind of pulsing beat at the difference frequency. So in our example, that's 20 hertz.
Right. And what's really fascinating here is where this happens. This perceived beat, it isn't out in the air. It's not in your eardrums even. It's actually generated neurologically, entirely inside your head.
Inside the head. Okay.
Yeah.
Where specifically?
It happens in a place called the superior olivary complex, or SOC.
The superior olivary complex.
Yeah, think of the SOC as the brain's first major sound processing hub that gets input from both ears at the same time. It's really crucial for things like figuring out where sound is coming from, sound localization. So because the beats are hitting each ear slightly differently, the SOC interprets that frequency difference as a phase difference. And that processing is what neurologically creates the illusion of the beat.
Ah, okay. So the brainstem is basically playing a trick on itself. Got it. So if that's the input, the mechanics,
Yeah.
what's the big idea? What's the theory everyone's chasing?
Well, that takes us straight to the core claim, the brainwave entrainment hypothesis, BWE for short. The central idea is pretty straightforward. If you feed the brain an external rhythm, like our 20 hertz binaural, beat the brain's own electrical activity, the stuff we measure with an EEG, will start to synchronize with it. It'll start oscillating at that same 20 hertz frequency. The brain essentially locks on to that external rhythm.
And that's why it matters for you, the listener.
Yeah.
Because different brainwave frequencies, these EEG bands, they're linked to different mental states, right?
Precisely. If BWE actually works reliably, then theoretically we'd have a direct way to nudge the brain into specific cognitive or emotional states. For instance, the theta frequency band, that's around 4 to 8 hertz. It's strongly associated with deep relaxation, meditation, maybe even creativity. Or gamma, which is much faster, above 30 hertz. That's linked to high-level cognitive processing, intense focus, attention.
So the hope is, listen to a gamma beat, and suddenly you can dial your focus up to 11.
That's the promise, yeah. That's the potential application everyone gets excited about.
It's a really compelling idea.
Yeah.
Feels very modern, very techy. But, we know from the sources this phenomenon isn't new. It was actually first described way back in 1839 by H.W. Dove.
That's right. But for over a century, it was mostly just treated as a sort of psychoacoustic curiosity. The stimuli is artificial. They don't really occur naturally. It wasn't until 1973 that a researcher, Gerald Oster, really pulled the early findings together systematically, and that, well, it didn't just kick off serious scientific investigation, it also kind of, unfortunately, inspired this massive wave of pseudoscientific claims and products we see today, often just assuming the effect was proven fact.
Right. Okay, so let's put the theory and maybe the hype aside for a second. Let's jump into that 2023 synthesis. This review gathered the best available neuroscientific data to answer that one key question. Do binaural beats actually reliably cause brainwave entrainment that we can measure with an EEG?
Well, when they sifted through all the available evidence, specifically the 14 studies that met their really strict inclusion criteria, the overall picture was deeply ambiguous, not clear at all.
Okay, ambiguous. Let's unpack that ambiguity with the actual numbers. The review zeroed in on 14 studies that rigorously tested BWE using EEG. Out of those 14, only 5 reported results that actually supported the BWE hypothesis. So finding the brain locking onto the frequency, that's already less than half.
Exactly. And it gets even starker when you look closer. 8 studies, the majority reported results that flatly contradicted the hypothesis. They found no measurable entrainment effect at all. And then there was one study that reported kind of mixed findings, maybe seeing changes in relative power but not absolute power, things like that.
Wait, hang on. 8 out of 14 found 0 effect, and only 5 found a clear positive result. Isn't that almost enough to just say, okay, this probably isn't real, maybe it's placebo? Or is the scientific community just being really cautious here?
That's the crux of it. What the review authors concluded wasn't a definitive no, it doesn't exist. Instead, their conclusion was one of severe doubt about the current state of the research field. They basically said the overall scientific tenability of BWE via binaural beats is seriously questionable. But, importantly, not necessarily because the phenomenon itself is impossible, but because the research field trying to study it is, well, you could almost call it chaos.
Chaos, that's a strong word for science. So this is where it gets really interesting, right? Why such inconsistency? If everyone's supposedly looking for the same neurological effect, this entrainment, why are the results literally pointing in opposite directions?
Yeah, the primary reason highlighted in the review is what they call substantial methodological heterogeneity, which is, the academic way of saying the studies were just wildly different from each other in design, in controls, and how they even measured things. So different, in fact, that they couldn't even pool the data for a traditional meta-analysis.
Okay, so they couldn't even average the results because the studies were apples and oranges. Give us some concrete examples of this methodological mess. This feels key to understanding why the research is so unreliable right now.
Okay, well, let's start with just basic experimental design. You'd expect some fundamental rigor, wouldn't you? Get this. 12 out of the 16 studies the team initially screened, before narrowing down to the 14 focused purely on EEG entrainment, didn't even use a proper control group.
12 out of 16. No control group.
Seriously.
Seriously.
In a field looking at subtle brainwave changes, how? How is that even possible? Doesn't that just invalidate their findings from the get-go?
It makes drawing causal conclusions incredibly difficult, yes. You absolutely need a solid baseline or a comparison group to know if the beats are actually causing an effect. And what's more, only 2 of the studies did multiple measurements before and after the binaural beat exposure. That's critical if you want to track actual changes over time, not just a snapshot.
So it's like they were just throwing darts in the dark, hoping something stuck. In many cases, the design lacked that necessary rigor. Yes, that's one major driver of the inconsistency. Poor design.
Okay, poor design. What about the actual measurement itself? How were they looking for entrainment?
Well, that's where the definitions just completely fall apart. There's no consensus on what BWE even looks like in the brain's electrical activity. Some researchers focused on looking for very specific, time-locked responses right there in the auditory system itself. Things called auditory steady-state responses, ASSRs, or frequency-following responses, FFRs. This approach is basically measuring how well the auditory pathway can faithfully lock onto the rhythm being played millisecond by millisecond. It's a direct response measure.
Okay, so one group is looking right at the initial auditory pathway response. Like, is the signal getting through accurately?
Exactly. But then you have another group of researchers who were looking for much broader changes. They were looking at shifts in overall EEG power across wider brain regions, or changes in specific frequency bands like alpha or theta power increasing. They're looking less for that precise time-locked signal and more for a general change in brain state, like becoming more relaxed or more focused.
I see. So if one team is looking for a really specific, fast auditory response, and other is looking for a slower, global shift in brain state, they're asking fundamentally different questions.
Precisely, and using different analysis techniques. So of course the results aren't going to line up easily. They might both be right or wrong about what they're measuring, but they aren't measuring the same thing.
It makes perfect sense why the results are conflicting if the scientists can't even agree on what the target phenomenon is. Is it the signal tracking or the resulting brain state?
Exactly. And then you layer on top of that all the technical variations, like the carrier tones themselves, the bass frequencies used to create the beat. In the studies reviewed, these range wildly from as low as 100 hertz all the way up to 900 hertz. Now here's a critical detail. Past research strongly suggests that the human auditory system is most sensitive, or perhaps optimal for generating these beat illusions, around 400 hertz. Yet, only 4 of the 14 studies included in the final analysis actually used that potentially optimal carrier frequency.
So most studies might have been using carrier tones that were just suboptimal. Maybe the auditory system couldn't even generate the beat illusion effectively at those frequencies.
It's a distinct possibility, yeah. They might have been handicapping themselves from the start simply by their choice of carrier tone. And there was another really curious finding related to noise. You know how sometimes tracks add pink noise, that sort of shh sound?
Yeah, it's supposed to be calming or help mask other sounds.
Right. Well, all the studies in this review that embedded the binaural beats within pink noise reported no entrainment effects whatsoever. None.
Really? That's counterintuitive, isn't it? I thought some earlier ideas suggested noise might actually help by making the pure tones less obvious, enhancing the beat perception.
That was some of the earlier thinking, yes. But based on this review of studies looking specifically for EEG entrainment, it seems clear. Adding pink noise actually seems to obliterate the effect, or at least make it undetectable with current methods.
Okay, that's actually a really concrete takeaway for future research then. If you want to find entrainment, maybe don't embed your beats in pink noise.
It certainly provides a clear variable to control for or investigate further.
So let's pull this all together for the listener. You see these apps, these YouTube videos, these products advertised everywhere for anxiety, for sleep, for memory boost, for focus. All these commercial claims, they basically rest on the assumption that BWE is real and reliable. Given what we've just discussed, what should you, the listener, make of those claims?
Well, I think you have to say the theoretical basis for many of those widely advertised applications is questionable. At best, it's built on shaky ground. Why? Because those applied studies, the ones looking at anxiety or memory, they nearly always assume BWE is happening. They rarely, if ever, actually measure brain waves to confirm entrainment is occurring alongside the reported psychological effect. So if the fundamental science trying to prove the basic entrainment effect is this contradictory, this messy, this weak, then any downstream application claiming benefits because of entrainment is resting on a very uncertain foundation.
So the science isn't quite saying it's definitely a hoax. It's more like it's saying, whoa, hold on, we actually have no consistent proof the core mechanism even works as advertised. Course. And maybe if you're relying on this for a serious clinical reason, you should be aware the evidence just isn't there yet.
That sums it up really well. And that's the ultimate thrust of the review's conclusion. For the field to make any real progress, they argue, two things absolutely must happen. First, the scientific community desperately needs to agree on a common definition, and crucially, an operationalization of BWE. What exactly are we looking for in the EEG? Is it ASSRs? Is it power changes, connectivity changes, something else entirely? Second, they need standardization of the experimental protocols. Things like always using appropriate comparison groups, agreeing on how to measure the EEG, using consistent analysis techniques, maybe standardizing carrier frequencies, basic scientific hygiene.
Right. Get everyone on the same page using the same ruler, essentially.
Yep.
But you mentioned something earlier. There was a little glimmer of hope, wasn't there? That maybe the phenomenon is real, but we've just been using blunt tools to measure it.
Ah, yes. That was perhaps the most intriguing little nugget in the entire review. They pointed out a case where researchers went back and reanalyzed data from one of the studies that had initially reported no entrainment effect, a contradictory finding. But this time, they used a much more sophisticated, newer analysis method called Higuchi fractal dimension. It doesn't just look at power, but at the complexity or sort of the jaggedness of the EEG signal over time. And that reanalysis, using that complexity measure, did find evidence supporting BWE in that same data set.
Wow. Okay, so the original analysis missed it, but a more advanced technique found it.
Exactly. Which raises the fascinating possibility that the failure might not always be in the phenomenon itself, but perhaps in the limitations of the traditional measurement tools, like just looking at spectral power that most studies have relied on.
So maybe the effect is more subtle than just turning up the volume on a specific brainwave frequency.
It could be. It might be about changes in the dynamics or the complexity of brain activity rather than just raw power.
So, okay. When I put on those focus tracks on YouTube, thinking I'm tuning my gamma brainwaves, I might just be giving my superior olivary complex a good neurological workout. But whether it's actually changing my overall brain state in a lasting, meaningful way, well, that seems to depend entirely on whether the original researcher used a control group, picked the right carrier frequency, and maybe used the right math to look for it.
That captures the current ambiguity perfectly, yes.
Okay, so to summarize our deep dive today, binaural beats, definitely a real psychoacoustic thing. It's a fascinating auditory illusion rooted deep in your brainstem's processing. But the big claim that these beats can reliably entrain your brain waves, causing a targeted shift in your mental state, like focus or relaxation. The current scientific evidence for that is, frankly, profoundly ambiguous. And this ambiguity seems to stem almost entirely from a shocking lack of methodological consistency. Scientists can't even agree on how to define or measure the effect properly. It really feels like the scientific community is still trying to figure out what exactly they should even be looking for, even while the promise of tuning your mind with sound is being marketed everywhere. And that leads us right into our final provocative thought for you to chew on. If the traditional ways of measuring brain activity, like just looking at the volume or power of a specific frequency, seem to keep failing to consistently capture this BWE effect, Maybe more sophisticated measures, like that Higuchi fractal dimension looking at signal complexity, do find it. Could that mean the real effect of binaural beats isn't about boosting the power of a brainwave at all? Could it instead be about subtly changing the organization, the efficiency, or maybe the computational complexity of your brain's electrical activity? Are we perhaps measuring the wrong feature entirely?